Good evening, everyone. My name is Gautam. I'm a member of Progressive Students Forum. Yes. Uh, as you all know, this is the part of our 10th anniversary events. PSF is just, the Progressive Students Forum TISS is just completed. It's in its 10th year. In TISS, it was started in 2012. And 2022 marks our 10th year. And as part of our 10th year, we have a lot of events planned spread throughout the year. And we decided to kickstart it by this lecture series. This first set of the lecture series is on the introduction to the history and the role of people's movement in India. And we have devised these lectures in such a way that each broad theme would have around 4 to 5 lectures within it, covering the multiple aspects of that particular topic. And for the history and role of people's movement, we have, considering the breadth of the subject, we decided to have 5 lectures, and this is the second of that lecture. And that first lecture we had last week, and which was on the agrarian movements given by Comrade Ashok Dhawale, who's the head of All India Kisan Sabha. The president of All India Kisan Sabha was part of the historic farmers' protest, the organization which in fact played the pivotal role in the farmers' protest. In fact, when we first thought of how to arrange these lectures, as a student organization, we sort of wanted the student movement to come first, because that makes as a student organization, we wanted it to be first, but because of various scheduling reasons, we could not make it first. But nevertheless, we are very glad that we're doing this, and and the history of the people's movement is not complete without the students' movement. If you look at right back from maybe right back from the anti-colonial struggles, where the student movement played a very important role, and through the post-independent years when we had during the emergency times. The student movement was a very important movement, and we've all seen or heard about various images or various movements that happened against the emergency led by the students, many of whom then went later to lead the people's movement in various parts of the country. And not just there, I mean, at every critical juncture of the country's post-independence history, the student union, the student movement has played a very important role. Going forward from emergency, let's say during the early 90s, in the protest against the liberalization, privatization, and globalization, when the neoliberal reforms were imposed on the people of India, there was mass protest, and the student union, the student movement of the country were together with the larger people's movement, and that trend has continued. For example, if you look at the CA NRC protests, like the students were a very important part. The latest farmers protest, students, were in complete solidarity with the protesting farmers, and throughout the country. And I remember back in 2018 when we had the Kisan Long March in Bombay, where the farmers walked from Nasik to Bombay. A lot of the students in Bombay, even from TISS as a part of PSF, were a part of the Kisan Long March. The point is that the student movement, while also fighting for the rights of the students and against the anti-student policies of successive governments, it also plays a role of extending its solidarity across other movements, and also feeding into other movements in the larger run. Now, that also brings to the point where we see ever since this government has come to power, they have incessantly attacked the institutes of higher education. In fact, that is one of their first targets uh, from 2014. So some of you may remember, many of you may remember, in fact, the protest that, but like some of the first, visible protest against the first NDA government came in the institutes of higher education. First to FTII, then there was JNU, then HCU, and in multiple campuses across the country was where the struggle against this Sangh Parivar government and its anti-student and its larger anti-people policies, communal politics have sort of mushroomed up. And that is precisely the reason also why the student movement is singled out and attacked by this ruling dispensation. Because they know the power of the student movement as to how it can ignite a larger uh, uh, solidarity among different sections. Uh, so I won't go much further into it. I think that's what this lecture is for. And before we move on to the lecture, I would also like to tell you that we have 3 more lectures coming up. After this particular lecture, we have on the 16th of July, that is Saturday, we have the history of trade union movement, which will be delivered by Professor Venkatesh Atraya. And after that, on 29th July, Friday, we have Comrade Subhashini Ali, who will deliver introduction and role of the history of women's movement in India. And this first part of the lecture we will conclude on 30th July, Saturday, with Comrade B.V. Raghavulu, who will speak on the history and role of anti-caste movement in India. So we hope all of you can join these lectures. And in fact, this lecture is a registration only lecture. So all the people, we haven't made it public anywhere, and we will make it public after all the lectures, this series of lectures is over, and then we will make it public on our various platforms where all of you can access it, later. Now, today to deliver the lecture, we have with us Comrade Arun Kumar, who is probably one of the most qualified people to talk about the history of student movement, as he was the former head of the Student Federation of India, the biggest student organization, progressive student organization in the country. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Comrade Arun Kumar to deliver the lecture. We will have the lecture for about 45 to 1 hour, followed by a question answer session. Over to you, Comrade.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. In fact, it's great to be talking about the history and the role of the student movement, because it is, I believe it is one of the areas which is facing a lot of challenges, and particularly now when the neoliberal regime, and also a regime which doesn't bother much about democracy or the ethos of the constitution, which carried out some of the legacies of our freedom struggle. So I think it is good to have a discussion on the history of the student movement as we understand it, and hopefully we can further carry out our discussion in the coming days, or even after the question answer session concludes in the coming days. But first of all, the context in which we are meeting today and we are having this discussion is also something very important for us to take note of, particularly in today's today, where we had in our neighboring country a very important development which is still unfolding. As you would all be aware, Sri Lanka had seen a never before seen incident where the presidential building was stormed by the people. The people had taken over it, and then the the private residence of the prime minister was put on fire, and there are people everywhere occupying these government offices and saying that the prime minister should go, the president should resign, and there should be a unity government, and all the economic hardships that they are facing should be immediately put to an end. Why I am bringing this to your immediate notice is for the simple fact that it is uh, the unrest which was brewing for quite a few days in Sri Lanka, which led to the present situation. And one of the major reasons why, for all these for all these around, I think, 100 days now, or a little more than 100 days, the situation in Sri Lanka was as it is now, and why the protests continued is because of the resilience shown by the youth and student organizations there, and most importantly, youth and student, apart whether they belong to one organization or whether they don't belong to any organization, it is because of the resilience shown by the youth and students of that country that these protests continued from day one to this day. And of course, prior to these protests, there were many sporadic protests and many long-term protests also that, in fact, catalyzed the situation to such a extent. For example, the farmers had protested against the changes in the farming practices that the present government had brought about in Sri Lanka. So all this, of course, this is not a place to discuss all these things about. But why am I bringing this to notice once again to remind you all is that the role played by the students and youth, which reminds us again the role that we ourselves had played in our country during the freedom struggle. Of course, it is when I say that we had played that role, it doesn't mean that we physically we had played that role, but the students and youth of this country, our earlier generations had played such a big role in the freedom struggle and also in shaping modern India, or trying to shape modern India as we find it today. So another incident that I want to bring to your notice, which signifies the or which marks an important phase in the transformation of the student movement in our country, is also, as it happens to be this year is the 75th year of our independence, the development or the landmark event that I want to bring to your notice about this year is there is another significant event that had happened 100 years back in our freedom struggle, which is the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement after the infamous Chauri Chaura incident. So we will be discussing as we proceed, as go along, what is that so important about the Chauri Chaura incident, or the not the non-cooperation movement per se, but the withdrawal of that movement, which significantly transformed the way the students of our country think about organizations and their participation in the freedom struggle. So we have to remember that this is not just the 75th anniversary of our Indian independence, but also the 100th year of the Chauri Chaura incident. So these two also, which we considering these two important milestones in our history, we can proceed to discuss some important role played by the student movement and how it had evolved and how it had involved itself in the freedom struggle, how it had helped in shaping the agenda of the freedom struggle, and whatever influences that it had in the post-independent India, if at all it had. So as we know, the Indian education system, yeah, there is a big debate on how whether it is only the advent of colonial rule that had led to rational thinking or the social reform movements. There is a big debate on that, and there are many historians who had joined in this debate and have noted that yes, certainly the English education or the Western education that had come into India after the colonial rule in our country, or after the colonialists had entered into our country, significantly transformed the way education is given to the students, and they had been exposed to many radical ideas, many modern ideas, the French Revolution in particular, the ideas of equality, liberty, and fraternity, and all these facts we know. But there is also another stream of thought which says that even despite of the British rule, or the British or the English education, there is a section, or there rather there was a section in our country which had developed a rational thought, taking inspiration from the indigenous ideas, and arguing for modernization of the society. Of course, not in the way the British had modernized or attempted to modernize our society, but in a different manner. But nevertheless, they were questioning the irrational practices that were prevalent, for example, like the child marriages, the ban on widow remarriages, the such practice of sati, education of girls, all these questions they were also bringing to light. So whatever it is, we can find that education had helped in a way in developing rational thought among the students, and making them question the practices that were prevalent in the society, and making them work to transform those practices for a better life. So this was always the role of education in a positive sense. Of course, there is also the negative uh, role for which education was imparted in our education, as you might be aware of the famous Macaulay minutes, where he said that the purpose of British education is to uh, ensure that we will be Indians in blood and physique, but we will be in our ideas, we will be converted into British to serve the British Empire as their clerks and officials who would be subservient to the colonial rule. So what we can conclude from this is that education always had this dual character. One, it has this reformist or revolutionary potential, which when put to use helped in the transformation of the society. The other is the use of education, which many of the ruling classes try to really use it to subdue whatever challenges are that they are encountering, and in order to preserve their hegemony, they used education to indoctrinate the minds of the people in that particular period, so that they can continue with that rule. So there are always these what we say, a struggle or a tussle between these two aspects of education. But now what we will be more or less looking at is the progressive aspect of education, and how the students of India have utilized this aspect of education to involve in to look at some of the social issues that they had that they were confronting, and how they had used it to transform their existing reality. So now, while introducing this subject, our comrade had just mentioned about how higher education is sought to be privatized and liberalized particularly after the era of globalization or neoliberalism that started in the early 1990s or late 1980s. But in fact, it will be surprising to see that there is always this debate counterposing higher education with primary education, and what should be the state's role in higher education. What should be the state's role, whether it should be investing its resources in developing higher education, or whether it should be concentrating more on primary education. Why I'm bringing this to your notice is that in 1875 there is this in a local journal called Lokaranjani, which talking about the education developments of that period, had stated that had expressed its opinion, saying that higher education should be self-supporting, or it should be self-financing, as we are calling it today. And it should be the costs of imparting higher education should be collected, and money should be saved in the process, and that money should be educated should be sorry spent on mass education. So this counter positioning of higher education with mass education or primary education always existed, like as I mentioned just now, from 18 at least from 1875. Of course we know that after that Gopal Krishna Gokhale had come out saying that everybody should be educated, universal primary education. He had brought out all these demands. But in spite of that, though these demands were made of universal primary education, when the question of higher education had come, it was always like a hotly debated topic. And it was, many had this feeling that higher education should not be made available free of cost. It should be charged, or it should be rather used for cross subsidization purposes. And this is one of the important things that our student movements of that particular period, since those days, were always trying to uh, uh, confront and trying to look into this debate, like how should the student movement be looking at the education, the access to education rather, whether access to education of at all levels, whether it should be universal, whether it should be free, and what should be the quality of education, and should there be a price levied on the quality, depending on the quality of education provided. These were always the debates from day one in the student movement. But on one question, everybody had more or less a uniform position was on primary education, that everybody, there should be a mass literacy campaign that should be run by the government. There should be, of course, the ruling classes were opposed, but majority of the common people and also the middle classes that were growing in the early periods of or the late periods of the 19th century and the early periods of the 20th century, they were all arguing for mass education and free primary education, universal primary education. So this difference always existed from that period onwards. Now, if we look into the evolution of the student movement, we find that in the initial days, even before the establishment or even before the Congress was formed in 1885, there were people who were taking or giving representations to the British administration, talking about various issues concerned with education. And of course, as I had mentioned, there were social reformers who were talking, who were asking, in fact, egging the British administration to start education institutions for the girls, and asking uh, uh, primary schools to be started in English language, and science should be taught so that rational thought is inculcated. But apart from that, we find that there were a section of people who were, in fact, petitioning the British to ensure that the traditional practices, quote unquote, traditional practices, remain, and they are not affected by the zeal of the British to start schools. And here I want to bring to your notice a memorandum that was submitted in the name of citizens of Madras in 1817, where they said that the missionaries should not be allowed to start schools in Hindu localities. The reason they had given is that if these schools are started, the untouchables, so-called untouchables, the Dalits, they would be attending these schools. So they would be walking through the streets that were restricted to them. And in those streets, which are till then preserve of the upper caste, will be polluted because of their walking on those streets. So they had petitioned, in fact, to the British, saying that they missionaries should not start the schools in Hindu localities. They can start it anywhere else, but not in these upper caste localities. So in that sense, the issue of caste discrimination was also present, and the efforts to continue with these discriminatory practices was also there, as we see from this example. Why am I bringing these two incidents? One, the incident of higher education and the thoughts, the ideas that went behind them, and two, the issue of caste discrimination. I am bringing this to your notice for two reasons. Because even after 2 centuries, or for example, 2 centuries on the issue of caste discrimination, or more than 1.5 century on the issue of higher education, charging higher education or using it to cross subsidize other sectors of education. These are still prevalent in our education system even today. And these are two challenges that the student movement is confronting with even today. So when we discuss the history of student movement, we also have to understand that there is still an unfinished agenda for the student movement, right from those days when the modern education system had been started in our country. Uh, so when we talk about this unfinished agenda, we also, I think, a discussion about the history of how the student movement of that period tried to address these particular challenges. A knowledge of that struggle, those struggles, will help us in shaping our struggles and will help us in learning from those experiences and frame our strategies accordingly in order to succeed where the earlier movements had failed. Um, so the as I was mentioning, the student movement had its genesis immediately after the modern education started. There were various efforts to organize students in various ways, like for example, in Calcutta at that point of time, Derozio tried to organize them in the name of Young Indians, and there were many other organizations also that were set up to organize students. They were more or less at the institution level or more or less at the uh, city level, but nevertheless they were all talking about the way students need to involve themselves in the society, how the students need to uh, focus their attention on the issues that are confronting the Indian society. These were all debated in the even in the late 19th century. And these debates have gathered pace after the formation of Congress, where most of the Congress leaders also tried to, because most of them are coming from middle class sections or the emerging bourgeoisie at that point of time, they all tried to concentrate on trying to address some of the issues that are confronting their particular those particular sections from which they are coming. Like for example, initially the demand to, when the British tried to reduce the age of civil service exam for the students who were appearing for the civil service examination, like the ICS examination, immediately the Congress took up cudgels and was saying that this reduction in the age limit should not be done, and the age limit should be should remain as it was. So in that sense, they were taking those issues, and they were putting up petitions before the administration. They were asking some of their community members to sign those petitions. They were going appealing to the people, appealing to the rationale of the government, and they have started various dailies, newspapers, periodicals, and writing articles arguing their case. In that way, they are trying to both prepare the society for arguments and also prepare the society for taking up these demands to the British administration. Uh, this phase of the student, this initial phase of the student movement attained a certain level of uh, active involvement of the students. Uh, it might not be active, might not be a correct description of the word, but or more I'm unable to find a proper word. So I think you might be able to understand why I'm referring to this as an active involvement, because earlier it was more or less passive way in which the memorandums were being written. It was all the newspapers, articles, and other things that we were talking about. But in this particular period, like after the division of Bengal and after the during the Swaraj movement, during the Home Rule movement, it is during this period that we find a very active involvement of the students in the freedom struggle. We find the active participation in various revolutionary organizations like the Anusilan Samiti, the Jugantar, and also influenced by these organizations, we find many young people coming out, taking out in whatever kind they are expressing their anger against the British officials, sometimes throwing stones at them, sometimes killing officials who were found to be responsible for the atrocities that were being committed on the Indian people. In these kind of ways, in these kind of various methods, the students try to express their resentment on the condition of the Indian people in the society, and also the students. There were many interesting incidents also during this period. For example, in one incident, there were two students who were going to mm, a market. This is in Andhra Pradesh, and it is the Telugu language which I am now referring to. So they found a British arguing or bargaining with a vendor who was selling lemons. So they went and the bet they had, these two students had among themselves, was who will shout the slogan Vande Mataram in front of this British and escape unbeaten. So this was the bet. So they went there, and immediately one of them shouted the slogan Vande Mataram. This and they started repeatedly shouting the slogan. So British official who was bargaining for the lemons got very angry, upset, and came to beat them. So immediately they stopped that. The person who was the student who was shouting the slogan stopped him and said that, why are you beating us? Then this fellow said, no, you are shouting Vande Mataram. Yes, we are shouting Vande Mataram because as you were bargaining with the lemon vendor, we are also bargaining with the lemon vendor. Because in Telugu, Vanda is 100, A Matram is how much? We are asking him, how much does 100 lemons cost? Vanda A Matram. So in that way, the students were very creative, very innovative, and trying to always use any opportunity that got presented to express their discontent against the British rule. In another incident, in one college, we find that students going to the first floor of the building, and from there throwing stones at the physical instructor who happened to be British, and then running away. In such a way, there were many students who were trying to express their resentment. And then there were these famous incidents that were taking place in much more serious incidents in a way we can, if we can put it in that sense, taking place in Kolkata and in Calcutta at that point of time, and in other cities. So uh, all these show that the students are very active against the colonial rule. They were concerned about the atrocities committed by the colonial administration, and they were thinking about ways to put an end to these hardships that the colonial administration is causing to them as students, and to them as people, as citizens of this country. So when the colonial rulers, and particularly the administrators of the various educational institutions, who majority who invariably belong to the British, they found this growing unrest to be very disconcerting, and they thought that this should be immediately put to an end. So when the home rule movement was at a peak in the 1910, in that decade, in the second decade of the 20th century, they had issued various circulars saying that whoever attends a public meeting of a political character, they will not be allowed to enter that particular institution. And not only that, the educational institution, the management of the educational institution was also threatened, saying that if your students attend a public meeting or participate in any kind of political activity, the aid that the government is extending to your institution will be immediately put to a stop. So it was the onus was put on the administration also to enforce strict disciplinary measures to prohibit students from taking part in uh, anti-British activities. So, in this manner, the British also tried to intervene and prevent the students from taking part in political activities. Of course, these circulars and these rules that the British had passed proved to be not ineffective, but never. It shows that uh, the British were not taking any incident involving the students lightly, because they were very much concerned, because they themselves were involved in this debate that I had mentioned about the role of education. Because when the British were introducing education system in India, there were this debate whether education system should be introduced in India or whether education should not be introduced in India. It happened even among the British administration. A section of them were arguing that education will prove determinantal to the British interest, because once educated, these people will start questioning and start rebelling against the British administration. Others argued that, like Macaulay, they argued that education can be used to transform Indian citizens and make them subservient to the British colonial rule. So this skepticism among a section of administrators made them always be circumspect with whatever developments that are taking place, whatever in the colleges and educational institutions. So when they found that the students are taking an active interest in the politics of the country at that point of time, an active interest in the Swaraj movement, in the Vande Mataram movement, in the Home Rule movement, they immediately try to put a stop to it and try to restrict the activities by coercive actions. Of course, as history shows us, they were unable to stop the involvement of students in through such circulars and other things. But this gave rise to another debate in the 1920s about the involvement of students in politics, which we have to again consider it even in the present context, because when this debate of students taking active interest in politics or active interest in organizations or active interest in student movement or student unions, they say that no, students should not be involving themselves into politics. They should be confining themselves only to education, or bothering themselves about their career and their future, and should not be much concerned about politics. They say politics is something which is a very corrupt activity. So students, or particularly the brightest among them, should not be meddling with politics. So as I am now basically discussing with you students from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, which is considered to be one of the premier educational institutions in our country, I wanted to bring this particular aspect into your notice, because this is much more this aspect of apolitical campuses is much more prevalent in institutions like this, even in central universities. For example, in the Hyderabad Central University, which you had earlier mentioned as one of the places where the students had strongly expressed their protests against the present government's policies. So in the initial days of Hyderabad Central University, there were student union elections, but those student union elections were held on apolitical grounds. Like there were no student organizations as such which used to contest student elections. So it used to be always individuals who used to contest elections, and the departments from which they came used to, or the caste from which they had come, or the religion used to determine the defeat or victory of that particular student. So it took a long struggle, in fact, to change that particular character of the university, to convert into quote unquote political campus with the establishment of student organizations. And in this process of transformation, I think we should really applaud the role played by the University Discussion Forum, which played a significant role in the late 1990s and early 2000s, which now made this campus as political as it is today. But again, going back into the history aspect of this debate, as I was mentioning, was always there, even in that period, even in the late 1910s and early 1920s, which made Lala Lajpat Rai comment. In fact, he was presiding the first All India Students Conference. Though, of course, it was titled as the first All India Students Conference, it was not truly in that sense representative of all the India, because though there were representatives from various states, it was not majority of the students from the states. All the states were not present in that conference. So it was not the first. We cannot call it as the first All India Student Organization. Nevertheless, it is the first All India Students Conference, which was held in 1920, and Lala Lajpat Rai presiding that conference had very bluntly stated, saying that he is not in favor of those who were saying that students should not meddle with politics. He said that he thinks that it is stupid. It is the most stupid theory and also an impossible theory. The theory that says students should not meddle with politics. He categorized it as the most stupid and the most impossible theory. And he said that whoever peddles this theory is it might be because of their dishonesty. He says that whoever peddles this theory is because of their dishonest ideas. That means that in order to hide their selfish interests, they are stopping students from coming into politics or taking an active role in politics. So he says that it is not confused brains who are talking that students who are arguing that students should not enter into politics, but it is dishonest brains who want students to be kept away from politics. So from that day onwards, there is always this struggle, like our freedom fighters always asking students to take an active role in politics, active interest in politics, and participate in the freedom struggle. While there were always another section which were arguing students to be kept away from the freedom struggle, and students should be focused only on their education and their career. Even Gandhiji, for example, when he started this non-cooperation movement in 1990s, 1920s, he was also explicitly asking for students to come out of the education institutions. He was in fact calling the lawyers to come out of the education institutions. So he was also talking that the gradual withdrawal of children from schools and colleges, either government or aided, should be uh, followed by all the people of our country. So, in fact, when he had given this slogan of uh, peaceful, non-violent satyagraha and Swaraj in 1 year, it attracted a lot, a huge section of youth and students into the non-cooperation movement. They gave up their studies. They participated very actively in the movement. They started an active participation, picketing the British or those shops they were selling foreign goods. They were actively persuading the people to not pay taxes, to not cooperate with the British government, and all these activities they were very actively involved in. So so Gandhiji was in fact telling that Indian students should not think about education at that particular point of time, but they should be thinking about Swaraj. And only after Swaraj, they should be thinking about education. And even people like Chittaranjan Das and others are also talking in the very same lines. So when students with this perspective were asked to come and participate in the freedom struggle, that you should not think about your education, but you should think about the Swaraj of our country. You should not considering your future, but you should be considering the future of our country. They wholeheartedly plunged into the non-cooperation movement. So when this movement was withdrawn in 1922 after the Chauri Chaura incident, it led to a huge amount of disappointment. That is the reason why I wanted you to remember that 1922 to 2022, which marks the centenary of this withdrawal of Chauri Chaura incident, marked a radical transformation in the history of student movement. Why? Because the disappointment of the students and the youth in this country with the non-cooperation movement, withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, made them think about what the other ways to express their anger against the colonial rule. It was a period when the October Revolution had succeeded in 1917 in Soviet Union, in Russia at that point of time, and then the news of the transformation that the first working class state is uh, ensuring in that particular country is slowly coming into our country. So the youth are lapping up all such ideas, and they were thinking about radical methods of fighting against the British. So this is the period also in within our country we find the Jallianwala Bagh incident happening, which had angered many number of young people. We find Uddam Singh, we find Bhagat Singh radicalized by all these kind of ideas. So, and we find them starting organizations like the Navjawan Bharat Sabha, Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, and these kind of institutions working in northern India, similar kind of institutions working in eastern India, particularly in Bengal and that particular regions in southern India, with Madras as the basis, of course, in Bombay, which had a huge number of working class activists working to organize the students, and most of these working class trade unionists are just out of the colleges, so they put into use their education to organize the working class, because they found that this non-cooperation movement, peaceful satyagraha, non-violence doesn't really address the discontent that they are encountering. So they thought that class organizations, organizing the working class, organizing the Dalits, these kind of things should be done by the students. So there these alternative paths were opened after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement. So and also it was this particular or a little later, a decade after this, we find the establishment of the Congress Socialist Party, and also the the Workers and Peasants Party, and all such kind of parties being started in that period. So when all of them had come into organizing the students, they were all thinking about how should we organize the students, in what are the demands that we need to take to ensure that students get attracted into the organized movement. Of course, there is this question of anti-colonial sentiment that is always there. Apart from the anti-colonial sentiment, then how should this be attracted? So they used various kind of methods. They were conducting sports competition. They were trying to organize study classes. They were trying to organize night schools, like uh, to ensure or carrying out this literacy campaign. They were running libraries. They were running volunteer organizations, trying to intervene whenever there were floods or drought or famine, and trying to organize these social service activities so that they can penetrate into the poorer sections of the society, use their education to educate them, and listen to their grievances, understand their conditions, and bring them into the mainstream student movement, freedom struggle. In that way, broaden the scope of the independent struggle much more broader than what the Congress is envisioning at that particular time of at that particular point of time. So and they were also observing various kind of anniversaries of like the not just it was not the anniversaries of the freedom fighters as we are doing it now, but various kind of anniversaries which like the Ganesh Chaturthi or Kali, this Durga festival, all these kind of activities, all these kind of occasions were used by the students and youth to penetrate into the society, to attract more number of their brothers and sisters and bring them into the student movement or the youth movement, or and make them part of the freedom struggle. And when they had gone into the society, when they had entered and started interacting with the people, they understood that the people are also facing a lot of issues and lot of problems, not just from the colonial rulers, but also from the exploitation of the Indians ruling classes or the emerging Indian ruling classes. Like, for example, there were black marketing, there were hoarding that was done. Particularly, this became a major issue during the times of famine and drought. So the students intervened in this kind of issues. They raided the hoarders. They brought out those goods. They distributed among the people, and in that way, they found out that it is not just the colonial rule which is exploiting and oppressing the people of our country, but there are also a particular ruling class in India, an upper caste section in India, which is discriminating the uh, Indian people also, and also exploiting them economically. So they are taking up these kind of issues. So uh, naturally, when they started working among these poor sections, they were looking at the plight of the agricultural workers, and then they started understanding the economic exploitation of agricultural workers. When they were trying to look into the economic exploitation of agricultural workers, they also understood the social oppression that they were being subjected, because a major chunk of these agricultural workers are also Dalits or the untouchables that we had seen. So as students, then they started looking at the issues of untouchables and the Dalit students who were coming into the educational institutions. It is at that point of time that they found out that there are separate hostels for Dalits, that there is untouchability even among educational institutions, that they found out that there are separate dining halls for Dalits and separate dining halls for upper caste, that the Dalit students are not allowed to sit on the benches. They were not even allowed to enter into the classroom, but they were asked to sit outside the classrooms. So the student movement took up these kind of issues also. So why I earlier mentioned about that incident is to bring to your notice this particular aspect of the student movement, which is the anti-caste discrimination as the character of the student movement, because this is very essential even today. Because even in today many educational institutions, even in premier educational institutions like the AIMS, we find a huge amount of discrimination that is being carried out in the name of caste. There are Dalits who were discriminated. For few example, for few years before, there was this report by the Sukhdev Thorat committee, which was particularly constituted to look into the discrimination on the basis of caste in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, Delhi. So in the AIMS, the report says that basketball and cricket were considered to be the activities or the sports of the elite. Dalits were not allowed into these kind of sports. They were discriminated against. So these kind of discriminatory practices till recently are continued in even premier institutions, and I believe they are still continuing in many of the IITs and many other institutions. I don't know about your institution, but this is it. So the student movement of today, if it really has to concern itself, has to uh, take up take up the issue of caste discrimination also. So broadly, when I'm talking about the student historical role played by the student movement, it had brought into focus the issues of the most downtrodden sections into the society. It played a huge role in bringing them or making them part of the mainstream of the freedom struggle. It worked among the classes, the exploited classes of Indian society, like the workers, the agricultural workers, the poor peasants, and tried to organize them through various class organizations like the agricultural workers union, the trade unions in such manner. So this is the nature, this is the character of the student movement during the freedom struggle that we need to understand. One, it is anti-colonial in character. Two, it was concerned with the economic exploitation of Indian citizens, so try to organize them on class issues, so thus broadening the scope of the freedom struggle itself. And three, it was also concerned with the issues of untouchability and caste discrimination, and tried its level best to take up these issues, and in the field, direct field where they were actively involved, that is education institutions, and also take up these issues in the broader society. So this is the character of pre-independent India freedom struggle and its contribution in enlarging the freedom struggle. I don't want to go into the details like the role played by Bhagat Singh, or the role played by Naujawan Bharat Sabha, or the role played by Master Surya Sen and his comrades of students, particularly consisting of students in the Chittagong rebellion in the 1931-33 period, or particularly the heroic role played by Preeti Lata Vadedar, Kalpana Dutt, one of the pioneers in building girl students organization, girl students movement in our country. So naturally, when in this process that was taking place in organizing students during the freedom struggle, we have the formation of All India Students Federation in 1936 during the Congress sessions, or a day prior to the Congress sessions. Simultaneously, we find the formation of All India Kisan Sabha and also the Progressive Writers Association. So all these various mass organizations, as we term them now, are formed from these efforts that were taking place in various parts of the country. So when these organizations were formed, as a natural corollary, we find various state chapters being formed. And then when these state chapters are formed, they were not only confining themselves only with the political issues, not only they were not just talking about colonial rule, they are not just talking about economic exploitation of the society. With the formation of these student organizations, now they were talking about even the issues of education. They were talking about high fee, they were talking about detention system, they were talking about the hostel facilities or the lack of it, they were talking about the corporal punishment that were given to the students at that point of time. They were talking about the education for girl students. They were talking about the issue of eve teasing of girl students when they were coming into to attend classes or attend schools and colleges. So in this manner, they were also they were trying to link up the issues of the students and also the issues of the broad society. They were trying to link up the anti-colonial struggle with the struggle for the solution of the day-to-day issues that the student is facing in the course of their education, pursuing their education. So in this manner, once again, they try to establish an organic connection and impress upon the students the necessity to be having to develop a holistic attitude to look at the issues that they are confronting and also be open to the issues that the people were confronting at that point of time. It is precisely because of this holistic approach of the student character which made Nehru speak about capitalism and socialism in his inaugural address that he had given to the what we say the 1936 formation of All India Students Federation. Nehru, in his inaugural address, talks about he of course he talks about Palestinian cause, the Spanish Civil War, and he talks about the First World War, the other kinds of wars that were taking place in the world. Then he proceeds to analyze socialism and capitalism. He says that socialism, and he says explicitly that socialism and capitalism are rival systems. They are conflicting theories. And he says that socialism is a development above capitalism. And he says capitalism in an earlier time had played it might have played a positive role, but now it had finished its part. Now the time is for socialism. So in this manner, he says that it is the uh, socialism with which the student movement should be concerned with. And to quote him exactly, capitalism has helped in adding to the wealth of the world. It has fulfilled its function, and now it is a terror to further progress. He says capitalism has fulfilled its function and it is a terror to further progress. Therefore, in his words again, therefore, the next step is the question of distribution, which socialism seeks to solve. These are the exact words of Nehru. So he says that this, addressing students in 1936, he says that now the student movement should be thinking about socialism. Capitalism is past. It has even at that point of time, he says that capitalism had finished its time, had served its purpose. Now we should be thinking about socialism, because he talks, it is a question of distribution which socialism only will solve. Now think about it. After 1936, when Nehru spoke what he spoke at that point of time, and of course what Nehru did after 1947 till 1964, when he was the prime minister of the country, and from 1964 till 1998, except for that small period of Janata Party and the National Front government, a major section of that time was governed by the Congress, his party. What did they do? All these things are something that we need to consider about. So what I mean to say is that at that particular point of time, the student movement was conceived as not as a narrow movement confining itself to the issues of fee, to the issues of hostels, to the issues of students' unions, or to the issues of education. It was confined as it was conceived as something that should be contemplating about much broader questions of the society, the systems of the society, capitalism, socialism, and all these questions were thought about. So that was how the student movement was conceived, and that was how the student movement also tried to live up to its role till the freedom struggle. After the achievement of freedom struggle, when the Congress had come to power, it was the very same Nehru who had said that AISF had also now had achieved its purpose. Now there is no need to be for an AISF to survive, and in fact the AISF should forego its rule of rising up the issues of students and questioning the government. In fact, it should be an adjunct to the government. It should be propagating the government functions. So when the AISF majority of the AISF leadership refused to heed to these arguments propounded by Nehru and his other Congress leaders, they split the organization. NSUI was formed. NSUI was thus basically intended as a platform to propagate the ideals of the government. So in that way, we find that the first student organization, the split taking place. Then we find again the formation of the ABVP, and such organization, ABVP explicitly formed by the RSS on the basis of on religious basis. So while NSUI was formed to propagate the ideals of the government, ABVP was formed to campaign for Hindu rights and Hindu for the honor or the pride of Hindus, as they called it, as they termed it. So in that period, with all these divisions taking place, we find a certain stagnation in the student movement in the 1950s and 60s. But after the 60s, again we find again a revitalization in the student movement, particularly when the uh, repression on the students and on the general uh, people also had increased during this period. So at that point of time, there was also a section that were arguing that the student movement should be not run as a student organization, but it should be run as a political party. And there was they tried to erase the difference between a political party and a student organization, and they said that Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought should become the guiding light of the student organization. So there were extremes. Like one extreme, we find NSUI formed to propagate the ideals of the government. On another extreme, an argument saying that the student organization should be run with Marxism, Leninism, and Mao Zedong thought as a guiding ideology. So between these extremes and between these demands, there took a split in 1970, and that led to the formation of the student organization, that which I represent, the Student Federation of in fact I represented earlier the Student Federation of India. And uh, it is at that in this period that in Bengal we find what was called as a lot a very intense repression unleashed on the democratic movement in the which was called as a semi-fascist terror in 1972, which in fact acted as a precursor to the internal emergency that was announced in 1975. So the emergency is once again another turning point in the history of student movement, because emergency was the initial resistance from the for the emergency started with the student protests in Bihar and Gujarat. Though SFI cannot claim that it had organized the student movement in Bihar and Gujarat, but in other states, SFI was actively involved in mobilizing students against the emergency and resisting the emergency provisions. In JNU, the student leaders of that particular point of time organized a severe resistance against the emergency provisions. They did not allow the police to enter into the campus. They fought for the democratic rights in the campus. So in that way, in many areas inside the country, in many campuses within the country, SFI was and the student movement was playing an active role in resisting emergency and fighting for the rights of the students to elect their own students union, for the democratic rights of the not only just the students alone, but also the society at large. So in this way, they were trying to expand and fight in defense of the democratic rights of the society. But immediately after the emergency was recalled and the elections were held, we find in 80s a spurge in separatist movements and terrorist organizations, the Separate Assam movement, the Khalistan movement in Punjab and in other places of the country, where the student movement again received a jolt. And many younger people were, and many students were sought to be attracted by these kind of sectarian and separatist movements, because the reason for this is there is a growth of discontent among the students in our country, and this discontent was sought to be channelized in a wrong direction by the ruling classes into the separatist movement, into these religious uh, activities, and into the identity politics of region, religion, caste, these kind of activities. So in 1980s, we find again a division in the student movement, a setback for the student movement. But again, it is once again in this point, at this point of time, we find the introduction of the new education policy and the initiation of the neoliberal education policies, where education is sought to be privatized, education is sought to be opened up for not only private investment in India, but also foreign investment. The concept of foreign universities, all of them had started. So once again, when these questions have come up, slowly the organized student movement tried to gather the students and try to bring back into attention the issues of the concerning the students and linking them with the genuine issues or the real issues that are confronting with the society. So they try to impress the students that they should not fall prey, or they should not allow any foothold to these kind of separatist tendencies in the campuses, and they should try to understand the reasons why the ruling classes are encouraging these kind of separatist organizations in our country. In that way, again, uh, this opposition to the neoliberal policies and education policies was sought to be built by the student movement. But when we look into the past 3 decades or 4 decades of neoliberalism in our country, we cannot say that the student movement had succeeded in posing an effective challenge to the advance of neoliberal philosophy in our country. Yes, the student movement tried its best to resist neoliberalism, resist the privatization of education, resist the entry of foreign education institutions in our country. In fact, we had succeeded to an extent. Like, for example, the struggle against the collection of capitation fee, the struggle where the Supreme Court were forced to give the judgment in the Unikrishnan in 1990s, where it was forced to say that 50% of the seats will be free seats and 50% will be private seats where the management can decide upon the fees, was in fact a reflection of the impact that the student movement at that point of time had uh, through its struggle. Later, of course, this judgment was overturned by the TMA case judgment in early 2000, in the first decade of the 2000s, where it was said that government doesn't have any right to decide upon the fees that the private institution collects. And so the government's right was taken away, and it was said that private institutions have got the right to decide whatever fees they want. But once again, it was the intervention of the student movement that made the Supreme Court review its judgment on its own. And then we have the Ismail judgment that comes out a little later, where again the government was allowed to form a committee to decide upon the fee structure. So we can in a way say that though the student movement could not put a stop to it or stop the expansion of neoliberal policies, it was able to uh, uh, achieve some concessions from the state to ensure that there is some semblance of access still available to the downtrodden sections into education in our country. But there is one major challenge that the student movement is still confronting with. It is not a question of access to education alone, but it is more concerned with the ideas or the ideology that the neoliberal philosophy had introduced into the society. It had crept into the society in such a big way that individualism, careerism, not bothered about social concerns. These are some of the ideological impact, some of the effects through the ideological impact of neoliberalism that the society is confronting today. This is something that we have to address today in a very serious manner. Why I am bringing it to your notice is in 2010, I don't know about the recent surveys, but in 2010, there was a survey that was done by the Center for Studies of Developing Society in collaboration with a German foundation, KAS. I don't remember that the full form, KAS, which they found out that 29% of the youth in India have never heard about globalization. This is a very alarming feature. If 29% of Indian youth who are educated have never heard about the globalization phenomena itself, how can we expect them to understand what it is and confront globalization or liberalization? this is a major challenge before us. And another feature is half of the, this is we can consider as the question of half full, whether the glass is half full or half empty. Half of the disadvantaged sections in the society feel that uh, globalization is disadvantageous. Means half of the poorer sections in the society who know about globalization feel that it is disadvantageous to them. Half of them don't feel it is disadvantageous. So it can be, look, if we can look at half are feeling it as uh, disadvantageous, the other half unfortunately are considering it to be some sort of an advantage to them from which they can benefit. So this is one of the major challenges before the student movement today. So when we think about students as apolitical, or when we think about students as concerned about social questions, we need to think about how the neoliberal philosophy had impacted on the thought process of students and youth at large in our country. But hearteningly, there is a major change that is taking place in our country in the recent period, which comes out that uh, students are slowly, there is an increase in the number of students who are showing an interest in politics. Because in 1997, 1996, the same organization, CSDSKS, they say that 37% of the youth said they were interested in politics in 96. But in 2010, they said that 52% of the students said they are interested in politics. So it is better. We find that slowly there is a gradual increase among the students about politics. Why is this transformation taking place? Because worldwide, after 2008, we find a recession, we find unemployment, we find jobless growth taking place. So the students are reacting to these kind of incidents and are trying to look into the social questions also. And we also find that uh, they are concerned not only about the careers that globalization is offering, but they are also concerned about the careers from which they are denied access by this very globalization. And the what we say, the precarity of employment that this present phase of whatever little employment is being offered in the society. So this is one of the aspects that we need to consider in the recent phase. There is another uh, uh, aspect which is also another worrying aspect that we also should be concerned about. That is, in a recent survey conducted by the National Book Trust, they found out that three-fourths of Indian youth have become very religious today, and one in every three of the literate among them are saying that they believe astrology, and they think that astrology is based on some scientific principle. So three-fourths have become of the youth have become religious, and one third of the youth who are educated think that astrology is having a scientific basis, and they believe in that. So this is a perfect raw material for the communal forces in our country to flare up the present discontent that is being generated among the people, among the citizens in our country. So as unemployment grows, as denial to access of education increases, we find that the growing religiosity among the youth of our country, the uh, growing irrational ideas in the youth of our country because of the insecurity feelings that the present system is generating among them, is proving to be a very fertile ground for the growth of communal forces in our country, which is a major challenge that we need to be concerned about. And one particular survey carried among the young people in Andhra Pradesh says that 65% of the men and 42% of the women surveyed said they would endorse violence against somebody who showed disrespect to their religion. 66 percentage of the men and 42% of the women said they would endorse violence against someone who they perceive to show disrespect to their religion. This is among the youth of this country. So this is why I meant that the fertile ground about growing religiosity, the insecurity is being used by the present dispensation, communal forces, fundamental sectarian forces to sow seeds of discord among the youth and students of our country, which is a major challenge for the students and youth in our country. But a very heartening feature, again, another feature from the history of the contemporary history of the global experience, what teaches us is in Chile, we have the students playing a major role in the struggle against neoliberal policies, in what started against the 30-cent increase in metro fares. The struggle started by the students, which ultimately led to the election of a 32-year-old Gabriel Boric as the president, a former student leader, as the president of Chile. It was in the phases of this struggle, they went from against the increase of metro fare to an struggle against the patriarchy, against sexual harassment, against eve teasing, against and for the in defense of the rights of abortion, and in defense of working class rights, organizing the copper mine workers. Together, they started questioning the neoliberal system. They started questioning the Chilean constitution drafted in the Pinochet era, and struggled for the formation of a constituent assembly and achieved the demand for the constituent assembly. And now that constituent assembly had drafted a constitution which is a drastic departure from the earlier constitution, which guarantees many rights to the indigenous people and the downtrodden section in the society. So this is an active role, a result of the active role played by the students in Chile, along with the women and the working class of Chile. So what we can learn from this struggle of Chile is that students, if they combine their forces with the women and other organizations in the society, then whatever be the strength of the opposing force, they can be challenged, not only challenged, but can be defeated. This is precisely what we can learn even from Sri Lankan experience also. As I said, it was the farmers who might have sporadically struggled against the Rajapaksa administration, but it was the resilient spirit shown by the youth and students that made this protest, that ensured that this protest continue till the storming of the presidential palace, till the fleeing of Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and capture of the presidential palace, and the burning of the the house of the prime minister, forcing the prime minister to resign and forcing the president to say that he will resign on the 13th of this month. So what we can understand is that there are challenges that the communal forces, sectarian, religious sectarian forces are posing, and the situation is ripe for such forces to grow. And on the other hand, we find the situation to be ripe even for the forces who can challenge the existing system, who can envision a better world, who can envisage, who can, if they can sell the dream of a better world to the people are ready to accept that dream, as we can learn from Chile and Sri Lanka. So this, I think, is the challenge that the student movement today should take upon itself, because if we have anything to learn from the student movement of yesteryears, it is that democracy, freedom, and oppression, exploitation are the concerns of the freedom, are the concerns of the student movement, and these are the concerns for which the student movement had fought against during the freedom struggle, and continue to fight till this day, and it should continue to fight even in the coming days. So I want to conclude. I think I have exceeded my time by 15 minutes. I want to conclude by quoting Percy Bysshe Shelley, whose bicentenary was just marked on the 8th of July, which is very, very important. Now, he wrote, "Nature rejects the monarch, not the man. the subject, not the citizen. Nature rejects the monarch, not the man, the subject, not the citizen. And obedience, and obedience, bane of all genius, virtue, freedom, truth, makes slaves of men and of the human frame, a mechanized automaton. He says that blind obedience makes is a bane for all the genius, virtue, freedom, truth, and it makes the people slaves. So he says that students or people should not be blindly obedient to any hero or any larger than life size figures that are being promoted today. That is what even Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had talked about when he was uh, uh, moving the new constitution for acceptance in the Constituent Assembly. He talked against hero worship and bhakti of individuals, and he said that this will prove to be determinantal to the future of Indian society, to the democracy of the hard-won democracy and freedom of India. So we have to take inspiration from all these people who laid their lives for the freedom and for a better society of our country. In fact, Jawaharlal Nehru had said, "Who lives if India dies, and who dies if India lives?" So, this should be the thought that should guide us into action. We should always be uh, thinking that for our future is intermingled with the future of the country. So, unless the country is good, unless we fight for the betterment of the country, we cannot have a good or a better future. This should be the concern of the student movement. And for this, we should strive to further strengthen the student movement for the better of our society. Thanks a lot, comrades and friends.
Hi, thank you, comrade. Thank you for that wonderful, taking us through almost 100, more than 100 actually, almost 150 years of the student struggle, the student movement in India. So let me quickly jump into the questions. We have a few, so I will put it to you because some questions probably can be clubbed together for the sake of time. So the first is, uh, please give me a second.
Dhruv, is it Dhruv?
That's the last one. I think I'll start
Okay.
from the beginning. Okay, the first is, how has the trend of students' movement changed in the current scenario? What are the impacts of ban on campus politics in the current scenario of student movement? I think linked to that is the question about from Punya about how can the student movement be strengthened in the present times with rapid privatization and increased self-financing colleges and universities? I think we can take this together.
See, ban on student politics has been in place for at least now 40, 50 years in our country. From 1980s, student activities are banned in states like Andhra Pradesh, the United Andhra Pradesh. And now, I believe even in Bengal, student union elections are being banned after the Trinamool Congress had come to power. So as I was telling, the neoliberal policies promotes this apoliticization of campuses. So unless we challenge this very basis of neoliberal philosophy, we cannot ensure that students will uh, be accepting even our idea of fighting for a students union or elections for the students union. Because if you go to the students immediately and say that we have to take up this demand of student union elections, they immediately now say that no, this is not our demand today, because what I am concerned is my future, my education. Student union elections is for somebody professional agitators or professional student organizers, not for me, a lay student. So unless we try to erase this distinction or pseudo wall that was erected between students and the organizations, we cannot think that students will be uh, open to this idea of students union. So unless we fight this uh, or explain to the students the link between policies and politics, and politics and problems, we cannot convince them to fight for a students union. This will be more successful today when in the overall country we find a big attack on democratic rights. We find democratic rights threatened in everywhere in the country. If you are questioning, you are being arrested. If you are questioning, you are being slapped with umpteen number of cases, not just in one place, but in various places to harass you. So it is becoming day by day very clear that the only intention is to harass you, to ensure that your voice is not raised. So this broader, now there is a this feeling of suffocation is slowly growing among all right thinking persons in the country, and students also are feeling suffocated on many counts, whether it is the introduction of nep, whether it is the introduction of new rules and regulations, like in, for example, in research there are many changes that are being introduced by the ugc. In the courses, new changes that the UGC is sought to introduce, like 4-year degrees, and now then what we say, the across the stream, forcing students to study sciences when they are not interested to study sciences. Many these such kind of things are coming up. So these are many issues that student will are feeling suffocated with. So unless we link these issue problems with policies and politics, we cannot uh, raise this issue of a student union. And this is the way I think, even for the my answer for the other part of the question, like what is the future of student movement in the country today, how can it progress in the country today. And now the second part, I think, is the question of self-financing institutions. You see, self-financing institutions or private, when we were in the student movement, 70% of the students were in government institutions, so it was rather easy for us to go and organize students in government education institutions. But if you remember what I had been talking with you for the last 1 hour, I was talking about how the students government institutions were at that point of time were also a no-go area for the student leaders of that point of time. Government education institutions were run by the British. They were a no-go area for the student leaders at that point of time. But they had used, that means that they were just like the private education institutions of today. But even then, the student leaders of that point of time devised many creative, innovative means to overcome that obstacle and organize students. In the similar manner, we also have to be creative enough to overcome the obstacles posed by the self-financing institutions or private education institutions. For example, they had organized volunteer organizations, they had organized libraries, they had organized study circles, they had organized uh, what we say volunteer groups during floods. They went to localities to talk with the students and organize them. So these are something that we need to even consider even today. We can think about organizing libraries, we can do all these things even today to organize students in the self-financing institution. So if we are creative enough, for example, you can start a film debating club, you can debate about the Prithviraj Chauhan, you can debate about Kashmir files, you can debate about Vikram, and you can say how why they are wrong and what is correct. So through films, through sports, you can debate whether Virat Kohli needs to be in the T20 team or not. We can debate whether IPL is commercialization of sport or not, whether IPL is good, whether ISL is good, whether Pro Kabaddi League is good. So all these things are matter of debates which you can use to organize students. And this very platform that you have now, Progressive Students Forum, is one such forum where you are trying to circumvent the restrictions imposed by the administration to politicize the campus. So this is an innovative method, and there are many more such innovative methods that we can think about to circumvent the restrictions imposed by these kind of institutions.
Okay, thank you for that very detailed answer. In fact, that these are some of the strategies that we use, and we've been thinking about some of these. Hopefully, we can also pick up, more of what you mentioned. And in between, you did mention about the new education policy, and we have a question that is somewhat related to it. I think I'll take that next. Saloni, who asked, like the higher education regulation has now instituted new mechanisms like graded autonomy. Autonomy for higher education institutions have been a major demand of student movement in India. How is this nature of graded autonomy different from what the student movement has been demanding? What are the possible consequences of this policy with respect to funding and curriculum design?
See, I was in the student movement till 2008. That's, I don't know how long it is now. 2018, 15 years. I have 15 years or so. I left the student movement. So I am not a better person to what we say or answer it with giving you the many minute particularities in this question. But broadly, I can say, because autonomy was always a concern of the student movement, what I can share with you broadly is that the autonomy that the student movement was demanding is academic autonomy. But the the autonomy that the government wants to give is financial autonomy. Financial autonomy in terms of increasing the fee and denying access to the people, making them more elite institutions. So if it, as far as academic autonomy is concerned, we should be for it. As far as financial autonomy is concerned, we are against it. It is like privatization. It is like government escaping from its responsibility. So we should be opposing that.
Absolutely. And I think, in fact, financial autonomy means you go find your own funds, right?
Yeah.
So next is more of a broader question, more international. How instrumental were the student movements in other, socialist countries where a socialist government came to power, and what is the role played in these countries?
So this is a big question here. You were talking about 1917 Russian Revolution, 1949 Chinese. See, we cannot discuss it. But 1911 in Chinese Revolution, 1911, the May 4th movement was a movement by the students which had inspired Sun Yat-sen and other leaders, Mao Zedong, and all these people to come and start questioning the feudal oppression and the colonial oppression, and resulted in what it had in the formation of People's Republic of China. Similarly, in Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh was a student studying in France, and then he went to Russia, so then Soviet Union, and learned from the University of the East, or the oppressed of the East, where he got acquainted with the colonial thesis of Lenin, and then he said that he was in tears, his eyes got opened. Using that colonial thesis, he organized Vietnamese and then the Vietnam Revolution. Then Fidel Castro, when he was a law student, he went and stormed the Moncado barracks in 1953, well before the 1959 success of the Cuban Revolution. And Che Guevara, as a student who went around the Latin American countries to learn about the situation, joined forces with Fidel Castro, and together they went and with whatever forces they could that could survive the Granma trip from Mexico to Cuba, they mobilized the people, and they were succeeded in Cuba. Similarly, in DPRK, which is North Korea, Kim Il-sung was a student leader, while his father was a freedom fighter against the Japanese. Kim Il-sung, I'm not talking about Kim Jong-il or Kim Jong-un. Kim Il-sung was from the student movement. So in fact, if you look into that, even Lenin's brother was a university student, and he was hanged for his involvement in individual terroristic activities. Then Lenin, as a student, he was very much involved in organizing study circles. Then through that, the entire movement he could develop. So the role of students in that sense we find in everywhere of these movements, not only in the past but also in the present.
Okay. I think this is one topic that probably requires a separate lecture.
Yeah.
So I think next is more of okay. I'll go straight to it. The question goes: the progressive student organizations like SFI, which you are part of, have been advocating for larger unity of democratic student organizations. What is the position with aligning with identity political organizations? To what extent can identity political organizations can contribute to the student movement in the times of Sangh Parivar? I think very closely related is another question where someone's asked, like, many Ambedkarist organizations across universities are accommodating minority fundamentalist organizations. Active or inactive dual membership is being practiced in some of these organizations. I mean, how should progressive student movements align with these practices, or should we react to these practices? Because especially in central universities, this
is from Hyderabad Central University. Okay, see, friends, the point is, see, identity political organizations or identity student organizations are considered, we of them. One, there is a democratic content among them, like taking up the issues that were left unaddressed by many till that date, like discrimination, caste discrimination, access to education, and all such issues. And then there is also a sectarian aspect to that, like they want to organize on the basis of identity to promote their selfish in order to pursue their selfish objectives or aims. And in that way, they try to stop these organizations from aligning with other broad left organizations like SFI or other forces. So what we need to do is, I think, we need to be patient with the students who are getting attracted to these identity-based organizations. We should try to impress upon them and convince them to come out of those organizations and join our organizations, because we have a much more broader perspective, broader outlook, while taking up this very same issues that these organizations claim to take. If we try to debate with the leadership of the organizations and try to approach them through the leaders, I don't think we can achieve much. So it should be, we should, that doesn't mean we should go on poaching students from these organizations. We should debate with the leadership, but we should not make our opinions only because of the debates that we have with the leadership. We should never forget that the students who are behind these organizations are those students who are what we say are genuine, have some genuine concerns. So they should, in fact, somebody who should be with us. So with that perspective, if we function, though the leadership doesn't want to debate or poses all sorts of nonsensical issues, tries to bring up issues before us and try to impede our joint functioning, we should never lose the broader objective of trying to bring in these students into our organization. So with that broader perspective, we should work out our tactics in the long run. That can be, that varies according to time, and that varies according to the space in which when we are functioning. For example, when Rohit Vemula was killed, institutional murder of Rohit Vemula, we had joined hands with all kinds of organizations and fought against that circumstances that led to the killing of Rohit Vemula. When the Film Institute in Pune, the students were attacked, we fought with all the students together against that attack. When in IIT Madras, IIT Chennai, when the Ambedkar Study Circle was sought to be closed, we fought with all the organizations in the campus together against that move. So that is the way in which we tried to evolve our tactics. So there will never be a hard and fast rule. Where it depends on time, and it depends on the space.
Thank you. Thank you. I think next question is probably about the biggest identity politics organization probably. What is the role of, what has been the role, or has there been any role of Sangh Parivar in the history of the students movement in India?
Yeah, in fact, Sangh Parivar played a very big role in the history of the freedom struggle and in history of the student movement. The role it had played is, it had asked people not to join the freedom struggle. It had asked students not to join the freedom struggle. That is the role they had played. Instead of joining the freedom struggle, they had asked people not to join the freedom struggle. There is recorded evidence of Golwalkar talking with a doctor who wanted to participate in the Dandi salt satyagraha by giving up his profession. Golwalkar explicitly says, if you have so much of money that you can feed your wife and children without practicing as a doctor, you come to me. I will show you some other work to do, but don't go and join the Salt Satyagraha, or don't go and join the anti-colonial struggle. Don't go and join the struggle against the British. This is the role they had played.
Collaborators and traitors. Okay, I think we have one last question. Do you think students active in progressive student organizations should be systematically involved in mass and class organizations outside the universities? In absence of this, it seems one can find universities where left students' unions are dominant, but there is no larger political influence the left is able to exercise in those states. I think this is a very
See, one part of it is JNU, SFI and JNU always takes an active interest in the problems and issues of the non-teaching staff. Whenever the non-teaching, they try to help the non-teaching staff in their organization without directly involving themselves in their organization issues. No, their organization is there for them to decide. We will actually support their issues and try to stand by them whenever they organize some sort of struggles. And we also try to help them in organization when it is desired. So similarly in other universities also, we try to associate ourselves with non-teaching staff and teaching associations. These are class organizations, in fact. So in that way, we try to associate or work together with the class organizations. Outside the campus, if the question is meant to be about our role outside the campus, mass and class organizations, you yourself have specifically mentioned about what role you had played when the Kisan March was from the Thane district, Nasik to Mumbai. That march had come, that massive march. You yourself had worked as volunteers and participated in the march. That is what is getting involved in a class organization is. And when the Kisans were sitting at the borders of Delhi for 1 year and more, a little more, many of the students had gone there. Many of the students had organized activities and programs in support of them. So this is one of the ways in which you involve in class and mass organization issues. When the issue of when gender issues come up, when sexual harassment issues come up, we join our hands with the women's organizations. We take up, when the issues of sexuality come up, we join issues with the organizations that take up the genuine issues of sexuality. So in this way, we try to work together with various class and mass organizations. So there is nothing that prevents us to join forces with class and mass organizations. But again, this shouldn't mean that we leave our field of action and go and do all other work. So it's a balance that we need to maintain. If we leave our field of work, we will be hanging in balance, and slowly we will be cutting our roots, which is suicidal. So we should be nourishing our roots, that is our work among the student community, and spreading our branches, that is working in the mass and class organizations.
Thank you, Kamran. That's very well put. Nourishing our roots and spreading our branches. I think there's no more questions, unless anybody wants to put in the chat box. Okay. I think,
hello, Gautam. This is Bushra.
Oh, hi, Bushra. Okay, go ahead.
Hi. I'm sorry I wasn't able to type in the chat box because of some issues with the device. Anyway, I'll just ask my question here. First of all, Arun sir, thank you so much for this insightful session. So we talked about the Brahminical hegemony and the colonial hangover in the educational institutions. And there have been strong voices and a discourse by scholars and activists and various media outlets also on such symbolic violence faced by SC/ST communities. But if we look at the religious minorities, particularly the Muslims, their educational backwardness has also been pretty evident. the Sachar committee report that came in 2006, and it's been long then since then that we have, this has not been recognized by the government to find the causes of this educational backwardness among the Muslims. The government keeps coming with schemes to modernize the madrasas. And if anything, the community's cultural educational institutes, which are the madrasas, they have been portrayed as institutes of, nurturing terrorism and extremism. So I have three questions here. First, has there been any student movement among the Muslim community to address this issue? Secondly, what do you think the Muslim community students in the intelligentsia, as well as all of us, should keep in mind to raise this issue? Thirdly, how have student bodies like SFI viewed and stood for this sort of issue for the Muslim minorities?
One, uh, I think I'm stumped by the question also because I don't have, but it's a very serious question. I don't know if there are very many student organizations working in the minority institutions per se. But yes, there are minority student organizations like the SIO and other student organizations that are working again on the basis of identity to utilizing the discontent among the minorities, and particularly when the present dispensation, with the present dispensation in power, they are trying to utilize this discontent in for their own selfish interests. SFI, yes, it had its presence in some minority institutions, exclusive minority institutions. For example, in Hyderabad, when I was there, we used to have some units in some minority educational institutions also organizing this section of students. But otherwise, if you talk about minority student leaders, then there are certainly minority student leaders in SFI who were coming up, who were trying to organize sections from their own community in SFI, who are trying to build or trying to negate the perceptions towards organizations like SFI that are injected into the students of minority communities. So there were that took a lot of work for us to organize students from these communities. Then the other aspect is SFI always felt that, and it is in fact that the left-hand government, when it was in power, uh, tried a lot for the upliftment of minorities along with other deprived sections of the society, but still there was a lot left to be done also, which we had self-critically accepted. One of the things that the left front during the last years of its rule attempted was to introduce scientific curriculum in madrasas. So introducing science and other subjects uh, in the madrasas, but allowing the existing structure to teach the uh, rational subjects. So in this way, they try to introduce rational thought and scientific thinking also into these institutions, which was supported by the SFI also. So this is something. These are some two things that I feel we need to understand, and I think the third one is about today's condition, isn't it?
Yes, sir. In the age of Islamophobia, how do we address
Yeah.
this?
So in present situation where Muslims are demonized not just in our country but also world over, right from like 9/11, even though this had started even earlier, 9/11 proved to be a very big turning point in demonization of Muslims world over. Even the Ukrainian war now, or the war in Ukraine, is also being now used to demonize Muslims. In this situation, what we need to understand is that the demand for uniform civil code, or the demand for reform of Muslim practices, is raised by the Sangh Parivar in order to further push these minority communities into margins. So we should be treading a careful path, and we should differentiate ourselves from the demands that the Sangh Parivar is raising. For example, when we talk about the question of triple talaq, they want to criminalize this activity, but we should not. We should differentiate here. We are not for criminalizing of this, but we are for a slow reform of the entire process of divorce between Muslim men and Muslim man and Muslim women. This can be achieved not through enactment of a law, but through conducting a social reform activities. So, what does history teach us about? What did Jyotiba Phule teach us? What did Savitriba Phule teach us? What did Ambedkar teach us? What did Raja Ram Mohan Roy or Akshay Kumar Dutt? What did all of them teach us? The entire history of social reform movements teaches us that it is not laws that bring us a change in the attitudes of any religious community, or any religious attitude. It is the continuous, persistent, and patient work among the particular community, and convincing them, and making them realize the need to change the backward practices. Only that will help in what we say, bringing out a change in the practices of minorities, especially more so in this present situation, where they fall back upon their culture, where they fall back upon their religious identity to group themselves to, and try to organize in order to protect themselves, where they feel very insecure because of the prevailing atmosphere. So they try to even more become a cocoon, further cocoonize themselves. So in order to break this cocoon, we should not use force. We should allow the cocoon to break in a natural manner. That should be the way out in the present circumstances.
Right, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm sure that I did not justify your question, but I think that all of us need to work more towards finding an answer to the questions that you had raised.
Okay, I think we are already past 9. I think we can end soon.
There is one question. Why left parties are
if you want to take it up, that question, it's a very common question, but if you can very quickly maybe address that, and then we can end it.
No, I don't want to answer this question, but I want to pose another question for you to consider. In 1980s, the BJP has only 2 parliament seats. Only Advani and Vajpayee were the members of parliament. Did BJP become a spent force then? If it had become a spent force, why is it ruling in India today? The left parties might be having only 3 MPs today in the Lok Sabha, but so don't give up on them because they have only 3 members of parliament. Just BJP did not lose heart when they were only 2. They worked hard to come to what they are today. Similarly, if the left parties work hard, they will certainly come to again regain the position of preeminence once again. The point is belief in ideology, belief in the truth, belief on the people. If we have belief, if we have confidence, then we can succeed. It may take time, but we will never fail.
Yes, and I think that's a right note to end this session. I think there's no more end. We really have to end now. It's been almost more than 2 hours on a Sunday, so I'm sure all of you, want to end the weekend not very late. So first of all, thank you everyone for joining. As we said, we will have another session next weekend, next Friday. That will be on the history of the working class, the trade union movements, by Professor Venkatesh Atharya, who is one of the eminent labor economists of the country. Now, thank you, Comrade Arun Kumar, for taking us through, such a broad topic in such a short time. Especially the placing the entire historical context of the student movement within which it evolved, and it was very fascinating, at least personally for me, to see that a lot of the questions that we are faced with, for example, questions like should higher education be a public good, or should it be used to cross subsidize primary education, or the question of the dual character of higher education, public higher education, where it can one be a force for radical and critical thought and change, as well as the possibility of it being used for indoctrination by the ruling class. So these are the questions I think we still continue to sort of confront, and these questions have confronted throughout the history of the student movement. Also, ending on that note of optimism, where while there are challenges of increasing obscurantism, flaring up of communal passions based on the sort of the fertile ground created by this obscurantism and anti-rational thought. However, the promise or the possibility of building a larger front in association with other movements, and keeping an eye out for not just our immediate goals as student movements, but also to be organically linked with other people's movement. And I think that's the only way taken forward. I think that was a sort of the sentiment with which you ended your talk. So thank you for this. It's been really informative, and I'm sure as our organization also, we will take your points to heart. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And once again, thank you, Comrade Arun Kumar.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
bye.